Hello, and welcome to this evening's program, which is being held in commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the massacre at Babi Yar, where almost 34,000 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. My name is Erin Blankenship, and I am the Interim Executive Director at the Florida Holocaust Museum and the moderator for tonight's program. During this panel discussion, our guests will be talking about Babi Yar and Shostakovich's 13th Symphony. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items I would like to mention. After this program, we'll be sharing a link in the closing slide as well as in the comments section to a short survey. We would greatly appreciate if you would take a few moments to complete the survey and let us know what you thought about this program. Your feedback lets us know how we're doing and is also useful in future grant applications. I'd also like to thank a few people and organizations who are helping to make this program possible. First, I want to thank the museum staff who've organized this program, especially Donor Relations and Special Events Manager Meg Carlone, who conceived the idea for this program and helped us identify our panelists and partners, and Outreach and Programs Manager Fawn Walker, who is doing all of the behind the scenes production to make it more successful. And thank you to Amy Alvarez Baruch, our desktop support technician, and Marketing and Communications Manager David Myers for making sure the technology and streaming goes as planned. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Sergei Borisov, who was a great help in formulating this event. And I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you about a special presentation with Dr. Borisov that will be right here on our Facebook page tomorrow, September 30th at noon. Dr. Borisov will be speaking about the landmarks of Babi Yar as a testament to public memory. So I hope you'll join us. We also have two special community partners I'd like to thank. Tonight, we're grateful to partner with the Florida Orchestra and with St. Leo University Center for Catholic Jewish Studies to ensure this discussion is successful. Finally, I'd like to thank our three panelists this evening. Ursula Szczepinska is the Director of Education and Research at the Florida Holocaust Museum. Prior to joining the museum 17 years ago, she worked at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw and at the State Museum at Majdanek on the former site of the death camp in Lublin, Poland. In her current role at the museum, she is responsible for teacher, student, and community education, and she also conducts archival research for Holocaust survivors and various projects at the museum. Professor Victor Peppard received his PhD in Slavic languages and literature at the University of Michigan. Dr. Peppard taught Russian at the University of New South Wales before coming to USF in 1975, where he is the professor of Russian studies. He has served as chair of world languages and is currently the head of the WLE Russian section and the associate director of the USF Institute on Russia. And finally, Daniel Black is a conductor and composer and is currently the resident conductor of our partner, the Florida Orchestra. Besides his work with the orchestra, he has guest conducted across the US, Canada, Ukraine, and Russia. Daniel has studied conducting at the St. Petersburg Conservatory in Russia and wrote his dissertation on the Shostakovich Symphony at Northwestern University. So now we'll have a little bit of discussion, and we'll start with Ursula. Ursula, would you please talk to us about the history of the events of September 29th and 30th in 1941?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Let me share my PowerPoint. All right, we'll start with this map from 1933. So before World War II, but the Holocaust started in 1933. So you can see the old borders and Kiev here. Kiev was the capital of Ukraine when the German army invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Before the German invasion, around 160,000 Jews resided in Kiev, comprising about 20% of the city's population. Approximately 100,000 Jews escaped from Kiev before the German advance. German forces entered Kiev on September 19, 1941. This is an archival photo from around that time. And what you are looking at is the actual ravine at Babi Yar. Since we are talking about the invasion of the German army, within a week, a number of buildings occupied by the German military were blown up by the Soviet secret police. And in retaliation, the Germans proceeded to kill all the Jews of Kiev in the ravine that we are looking at. At the time, there were about 60,000 Jews in the city. Most of those who remained were women, children, the ill, the elderly, so people who were not able to escape. In the territories that belonged to the Soviet Union before 1939, mass extermination of Jews was usually organized very quickly after the occupation of a given location. So in Kiev, it took only 10 days from September 19th to September 29th, 1941, between the occupation of the city and the start of the physical annihilation of local Jews at Babi Yar. You have a bigger close-up here of the ravine and Kiev. I should also mention that the date corresponded with the holiest day in Judaism, Yom Kippur. The Nazis and their collaborators often chose such symbolic dates to torment Jews emotionally before the physical annihilation. They also chose Jewish holidays as a symbolic way of to show triumph over the victims in the eyes of the perpetrators. Local Jews were summoned to an assembly point through announcements like the one you are looking at in Ukrainian, Russian, and German. Jews were told to gather at a certain point to bring money and valuables, warm clothing, bed linen. They were also informed that there would be a death penalty for anybody who would enter the property owned by Jews. Obviously, the word Jew was not used. Instead, anti-Semitic terms were used. Those lines about money and valuables and belongings were to calm the victims down. They were told they would be sent someplace else to work and live. In reality, they were robbed before being murdered, and the clothing and bed linen were taken away from them. The same with the line about death penalty for entering Jewish property. It was to calm the victims down, to make them believe that their houses would be well protected. Now, as we are looking at another archival picture, we can see Jewish victims handing over those belongings to the perpetrators. Victims then moved into the ravine, and Einsatzgruppen detachments under the leadership of Paul Blobel shot them in small groups. Not only Jews were murdered in Babi Yar, the first victims of the Nazis here were the patients of the Kiev Psychiatric Hospital on September 27th, 1941. And later the Nazis used the same site to shoot Soviet POWs, partisans, resistance members, and those Jews who were not swept up in the big massacre of September 29th and 30th. Overall, around 100,000 people were murdered at Babi Yar. On this map, you can see some of the sites where mass murder was carried out by the Einsatzgruppen. These were mobile killing squads that followed the German army into the occupied territories, and their only goal was to get rid of the perceived enemy. So partisans, political opponents, Roma and Sinti, and Jews. Jews were the largest group. Over 2 million individual Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in mass shootings carried out by the Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators. Those massacres were carried out in broad daylight. They looked like the massacre that you are looking at in this picture. Victims were not deported to death camps. They were marched from their homes to the execution sites in the vicinity of their homes, often in front of their non-Jewish neighbors, and they were shot at close range. In this picture, you can see Soviet POWs leveling the earth over the mass grave at Babi Yar. The picture was taken by Johannes Halle. He was a professional photographer before the war and a member of one of propaganda companies that the Germans established so that they could document Nazi victories in occupied territories and the annihilation of the perceived enemy. Halle was one of those photographers. He arrived at Babi Yar after the shooting. You can see several of his images here. These are some of the belongings that we talked about of the victims. And here, German personnel rummaging through what looks like a sea of clothing left by the victims. That roll of pictures was after the war sold by Halle's widow. He did not survive the war. He was killed during the Allied invasion of Normandy. But that film should have been submitted to his supervisor. He did not do that. And his widow sold it, and that's how the pictures were made public. Now, Einsatzgruppen would send reports about their operation. This is a quote from the report written by Einsatzgruppe C about the massacre on September 29th and 30th. You can see that the number of victims is listed as 33,771. And the belongings are also mentioned that we discussed earlier. This is a look at what the reports looked like. And in August of 1943, Operation 1005 began in Kiev. A group of male prisoners from the nearby Sirets camp, Jews and non-Jews, were made to dig up and burn the bodies of victims in Babi Yar. Some of those men managed to escape and give testimony. Paul Blobel, the same man who was in charge of the massacre on September 29th and 30th, was now in charge of Operation 1005. It started way before August 1943, but in August of 1943, the operation was brought to Kiev to destroy traces of evidence of the mass atrocity. In the picture on the left, you can see where the bodies were burned, because that's what the operation entailed. And on the right, you can see Soviet investigators in 1944 looking at the mass grave as the not all the bodies were burned. Kiev was liberated by the Soviet army on November 6, 1943, and in January 1946, proceedings in Kiev tried 15 members of the German police for the crimes at Babi Yar. One of the witnesses was Dina Pronicheva, an actress who survived the massacre. You can see a very brief excerpt from her testimony here, where she describes how she fell into the mass grave without being hit by a bullet, and later on managed to get out of the mass grave and was able to survive. Very few people survived. There were orders to report Jews who were alive after the massacre, and they were reported by non-Jews, local non-Jews. So even those like Dina who were able to get out of the mass grave were still at risk of being turned into the police later on. This is a picture of Paul Blobel from the time of his arrest and trial. He was on trial during the Einsatzgruppen trial. That was one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials. In the picture on the left, you can see him during the trial pleading not guilty, but he was sentenced to death and hanged at the Landsberg prison on June 8, 1951. We looked at some of the pictures taken by the perpetrators. We looked at pictures of the victims and after the massacre. I want to take us back to the time when the victims were alive. We will look just at a few pictures. I'm bringing those pictures up because the perpetrators and their collaborators wanted to annihilate every Jewish person and to eradicate every trace of their existence. We at the Florida Holocaust Museum do the opposite. We want to retrieve identities of victims. We want to know what happened, to investigate, to raise awareness of what happened. And then through commemorating the victims, we want to also draw lessons for us today. We want to remember that the massacres were planned and carried out by human beings who chose to hate the victims, who chose to dehumanize the victims, who chose not to see the victims as human beings. So we need to remember that people are capable of such horrific choices, and we need to make sure that such atrocities don't happen in the future. So let me say out loud the names of some of the victims. Manya Halef, this is a 1936 portrait on the left of Manya. She was later killed at Babi Yar. On the right, you see Polina Koval, who was born in 1914 in Zhytomyr, Ukraine, also murdered at Babi Yar. On the left, you see Arnold Belogorodsky, who was born in Kiev in 1936 and perished at Babi Yar, and Abraham Albert, who was born in Ternovka, Ukraine in 1871. Also murdered at Babi Yar. This is just a small sample of the names and faces that we want to remember. In the chat, I will put a link to Yad Vashem's database where you will be able to research more names and photographs. And I will leave you with this reflection and turn over to Erin Blankenship.
Thanks so much, Ursula. I learned a lot. I'm sure our viewers did as well. So now I'll invite Victor to speak about poet Yevtushenko and his work, which was used for the symphony, which we'll hear more about in a few moments. Victor?
Thank you, Erin, and good evening to everybody. It's flattering to be invited to this occasion this evening. Let me just say a few words first about Yevtushenko as a poet and really as a very person of all kinds of different skills and interests. He was, of course, best known as a poet. He was an actor, directed film, and was a world traveler. He's one of the few poets of his period who could travel, and of course a lot of this was after. Some of it was during the Soviet period and after the Soviet period. He happened to come to the Tampa Bay area a number of times. Already one of the early Russian Heritage New Year celebrations, I forget which year it was, he was there. He attended and performed there. He appeared at USF in Tampa, where he read his poetry, and also in St. Petersburg during the Treasures of the Tsars in '95, and Eckerd College as well, including the Festival of Reading. The thing about Yevtushenko as a poet is that he performed his poetry, and we're going to see that in a minute. This is a tradition, a well-established tradition, particularly in modern Russian poetry. Sometimes people compare his work with Yevtushenko, with Mayakovsky, and so he really, in a sense, he acts these poems out. I've seen him do that with a poem he called Karlikovые березы, and dwarf birches. It's really a remarkable sight. Now, couple of words about this poem before we watch listen mainly to him reading it. He's going to be reading, he'll start out in Russian, and then he'll go back to the beginning again and read in English. There will be a text that accompanies this, which is not necessarily exactly the English translation that he's using. There are a few different words, different phrases here and there, but the sense of it is really the same. One thing about, I should mention also this poem he published in 1961, which is not necessarily exactly on the 20-year anniversary, if you want to call that 20-year memorial of the massacre at Babi Yar. But that is part of what he did in publishing it in 61 was to underline the connection with the event that Ursula just described to us so well. One of the things he does, he sets out the atmosphere, if you will. He sets out the tone above Babi Yar, looking down on it, as looking down on this steep slope as though it were a crude gravestone. And then he moves very quickly to identifying himself with the Jewish people, saying that he's as old, he feels as old as the Jewish people are old. And then he says straight up, I feel that I'm a Jew. I think that I am a Jew. And during the course of the rest of the poem, he goes through, he cites various well-known Jews who suffered in one way or another, including Anne Frank, including Dreyfus. And his focus here is, of course, on people like that. He talks about the different things, the ways in which they were treated, the ways in which they were discriminated against, if you will. He doesn't of course use that word. It's understood. There's so many different images in the poem that do this. When he gets finally to, sort of toward the end, he says that I am each old man who was shot. I am each young boy who was shot, and so on. And his conclusion is that even though he has no Jewish blood in him, he is despised by anti-Semites universally, and they despise him as though he were a Jew, because his identification with them is so thorough. And this, of course, was a theme. It was anti-Semitism, of course, on the part of individuals in the society, but it's also true that the government was carrying out its own form of anti-Semitic politics, if you will. And so a lot of people, of course, admired him and still do for the courage he had to bring this up. And as we saw earlier, the Soviet authorities for the longest time simply did not acknowledge what had happened at Babi Yar, certainly, and did not acknowledge that it was primarily Jews who were executed. Toward the end, he finally says, excuse me, that although he has no Jewish blood in him and so on, he's despised as though he were a Jew. And he says, therefore, I am a true Russian. Ya nastoyashi Ruski. So as I said, you'll see a text running together with his reading. And after that, I just want to say one or two quick words, and thank you.
Над Бабьим Яром памятников нет. Крутой обрыв, как грубое надгробье. Мне страшно. Мне сегодня столько лет, как самому еврейскому народу. No monument stands over Babi Yar, a drop sheer as a crude gravestone. I am afraid today I am as old in years as all the Jewish people. Now I seem to be a Jew. Here I plod through ancient Egypt. Here I perish crucified on the cross. And to this day I bear the scars of nails. I seem to be Dreyfus. The Philistine is both informer and judge. I'm behind bars, beset in every side, hounded, spat on, slandered, squealing, dainty ladies in flounced Brussels sleighs stick their parasols into my face. Мне кажется, я мальчик. I seem to be then young boy in Belostok. Blood runs, spilling over the floors. The bar room rabble-rousers give off a stench of vodka and onion. A boot kicks me aside. Helpless, in vain I plead with these pogrom bullies, while they jeer and shout, "Beat the Yids! Save Russia!" Some grain marketeer rapes my mother. Oh, my Russian people, I know you are international to the core, but those with unclean hands have often made a jingle of your purest name. I know the goodness of my land, how vile these anti-Semites without a comb, they pompously called themselves the Union of the Russian people. I seem to be unfrank, transparent as a branch in April, and I love and have no need of phrases. My need is that we gaze into each other. How little we can see or smell. We are denied the leaves, we are denied the sky, yet we can do so much. Tenderly embrace each other in a darkened room. They're coming here, be not afraid. Those are the boom sounds of spring. Spring is coming here. Come then to me, quick. Give me your lips. Are they smashing the door? No, no. It's the ice breaking. The wild grasses rustle over Babi Yar. The trees look ominous like judges. Here all sings, screams silently, and burying my head, slowly I feel myself turning gray. And myself, I'm on massive soundless scream above the thousand buried here. I am each old man here shot dead. I am every child here shot dead. Nothing in me shall ever forget. The International, let it thunder when the last anti-Semite on the earth is buried forever. In my blood, there is no Jewish blood. In their callous rage, all anti-Semites must hate me now as a Jew. For that reason, I am a true Russian.
Well, you can see, you can hear and see, you can't really see him performing. I think we have a link that you can find. It's easy to find. It's on YouTube. Yevtushenko reading Babi Yar, where there's the beginning of it is from Shostakovich's 13th Symphony that Daniel Black will talk about in a minute. I wanted to thank him specifically for letting me know that there was this reading. I had seen him in person, but I'd never seen him read this. And also to Amy Baruch for setting all of this up. And finally, I want to say, imagine after his reading that, when he read that to an audience, people would come up to him afterwards and thank him profusely for having done it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now let's hear from Daniel Black as he gives us an overview of Shostakovich's 13th Symphony and why it's so significant.
Thank you, Erin. And what a wonderful, moving poem that is, and what an incredible, tragic history for Babi Yar. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Shostakovich and his symphony. And Amy, if you could get that slide up going. Shostakovich composed this in 1962, towards the end of his life and career, the last third or so of his life. I call it the Symphony of Redemption, and I'll get into more why I do. If we can go to the next slide, you can see Shostakovich later in his life. He was the true star of the Soviet musical system. He had a very complicated history. We can switch to the next slide. And I think that that is really summed up in these two quotes, one by the great cellist Rostropovich, who talk about the incredible things that he witnessed in his life and career. And then the second quote you can see here is from Shostakovich himself. And this is about, he wrote about Babi Yar Symphony as he was composing it, because I think he realized what a risky and dangerous thing it was to do so. So let's learn a little bit more. We can go to the next slide. There is a theme throughout this symphony of conscience. And a couple of things to be aware of. Shostakovich considered when he was composing that the voice represented, in other words, even though the text was written by Yevtushenko, because it's his symphony, he is appropriating the voice of this poem. So he is acknowledging and agreeing with it and presenting it as his own. And I think in order to understand what it meant for him to compose this symphony in 1962, you have to understand how the Soviet system essentially punished integrity. It rewarded conformity. In other words, if you wanted to survive in Stalinist Russian especially, you had to debase yourself. You had to submit and subvert your own essence in order to conform. And Shostakovich, I must say, was an excellent survivor. He wrote of the symphony, "I am again in the power of debt, a debt I have to fulfill, the debt of my conscience." Now let's take a look at Shostakovich's biography, if we go to the next slide, and why he had such a conflicted past. He was born in 1906. That means he was still a young boy when the revolution happened, and he received his musical training at a very early age, as you can see, completely under the Soviet system and he was immensely talented. He was one of the great musical stars of the period, and indeed of the entire 20th century. Because of this, from an early age, the Soviet government was very, very proud of Shostakovich and wanted to show him as the symbol of what could be accomplished by the Soviet system, by the communist system. But there was a dark side. You can see time and time again, the people that were close to him also suffered under the system. The person who he dedicated his first symphony to was later executed by the KGB. And a number of his friends and patrons and collaborators also suffered similar fate. In 1934, he composed the opera Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district, and this was a massive success, a huge hit in the Soviet Union, and it was played around the world for about 2 years, and then suddenly it was denounced. And it's thought that Stalin himself, after having seen a performance, was the one who wrote this denunciation. So immediately, Shostakovich's music was taken out of circulation. You can switch to the next slide. It was taken out of circulation. He withdrew his Fourth Symphony, and he really was worried that he might suffer the same fate as these intellectuals. But after composing his Fifth Symphony, it was a massive success, and his reputation was rehabilitated. The consequence of this is that Shostakovich, for many years, essentially did not write any music that had a text. He wrote lots of symphonies, he wrote string quartets, he wrote chamber music. He wrote some things with text that were more, patriotic, basically texts that have been handed to him by the authorities. But he didn't do text because text was dangerous. You can interpret text, and if the authorities interpret it the wrong way, then that could be a fatal mistake. If we switch to the next slide, we can see how, on the other hand, after the rehabilitation in the 30s, he also received the immense patronage of the Soviet system. He received numerous Stalin prizes. His family was one of the lucky few to be evacuated from Leningrad during the siege in World War II. So he received both the largesse and also the punishment of the system. And he had to walk a very, very fine line in order to continue to work, and indeed in order to continue to exist. He was censored again in 1948, but after Stalin's death, he was rehabilitated and continued to be popular and relatively unencumbered for the rest of his career. It's important to know this history, to know what it meant to him to see this poem Babi Yar by Yevtushenko. Yevtushenko was younger than Shostakovich, and he did not have to personally go through these purges. He did not have to personally experience what Shostakovich did. And so I think that Shostakovich really admired the courage that Yevtushenko had in writing this poem. And he decided, he read it in September of 1961. And so you can imagine, I think you can go to the next slide there. You can imagine, again, this was probably published as a 20-year reflection on the massacre. And he immediately decided to write a piece of music based on it. He didn't even contact the poet to ask for permission. He just wrote it first and then contacted Yevtushenko later. He really thought that this might not be performed. Now remember, he had not written really much music with a text for a long time. But here, he not only takes a text, he takes one that's very critical of the authorities. It's critical of how they had sort of tried to gloss over the history of this. And it's very, very empathetic of the Jewish people. Not only did he take this text, he also sets the music in such a way that the text is very clear and easy to understand. There is a bass soloist and a chorus of basses. and they sing in unison the entire symphony. So, and it's the melodic lines are very simple. It's almost like a cantor in a church or in a temple. Very, very simple and easy to understand musical lines, so that there's absolutely no question, if you speak Russian, of misunderstanding this text. The symphony was completed in 1962, and this was at the time called the thaw, after Khrushchev had taken over, and he allowed a certain amount of relaxation of the rules and criticism of the authorities and such. And so this was a time when you could actually maybe get something like this published, maybe get something like this performed. But by December, as it was being prepared for the performance, the authorities were kind of starting to change their mind. And we see that there was a lot of difficulties. Shostakovich's normal conductor friend, Yevgeny Mravinsky, didn't want anything to do with this piece. He thought it was dangerous. And so it went to Kondrashin. Meanwhile, the soloist, Victor Nechipailo, who sang all the rehearsals up till the dress rehearsal, he backed out at the last moment and had to be replaced by the understudy, Vitaly Gromadsky. So you see there was kind of like this effort to sabotage the performance, but despite that, it went through, and eventually it was performed. The Soviet authorities were not entirely happy with it, but it did not suffer the same fate as it might have suffered if he had written it in the 30s. At that time, it's very likely that he would have been arrested for such a thing. And so you have to imagine in this time period what it must have been like for Shostakovich, who had seen so many of his friends taken away, and felt an incredible amount of guilt and felt this sense of helplessness. He had towed the line. He had walked that tightrope in order to survive. He was a survivor. And now he felt this sense of debt, that he had to write something like this in some ways as a way of redemption for what he had failed to do, the courage he had failed to have earlier in the 30s and 40s. And I think that is really the great drama that underlies this piece. So I think on the next slide, we've got some sources. My favorite performance of this, I'm not sure if this is still published, publicly available, but if you can find the symphony recorded by the St. Petersburg Philharmonic with Sergei Leiforkus, who's a great bass baritone, performing with the conductor Yuri Temirkanov. That is an absolutely incredible recording, my favorite of all of those that I have listened to. And then below this, a few of the many books and articles about Shostakovich, which I think are very interesting, that you can kind of get in much more detail about this history of the work. And I'd like to leave, because nothing says quite as much as listening to the music itself. This is a musical excerpt, a video performance of the Mariinsky Theater, and it is the last portion of the poem, the last portion of the text, which I think is one of the most moving parts of this entire piece and poem.
Во мне про это не забудет. Еврейской крови нет в крови моей, но ненавистен злобой заскорузлой. Я всем антисемитам, как еврей, и потому я настоящий.
Thank you so much. Maybe at some future date, the Florida Orchestra could perform the symphony. That would be great. So I'm going to ask our panelists to join me on screen, and I'm going to circle back with a few questions that I have, a little bit of discussion, and then if we have any viewer questions, we'll bring those up as well as time allows. So let's start with Victor. Yevtushenko's poem and the symphony were very early responses to the events of the Holocaust, because as Daniel spoke about, the symphony was finalized in 1962, and it wasn't as widely studied and taught about as it is today. Could you speak about the response to his poem, both within Ukraine and then any more widespread response?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I can't speak too much about Ukraine. Of course, it was welcomed by Soviet Jews everywhere. And this is true, Jews living in the States who are, whether they're from the Soviet Union or not. The thing about Yevtushenko is that he was always controversial in the sense that some people thought because he was allowed to travel and so on, he and Voznesensky went around the world. They appeared in Australia, in America, in South America, and so on. Yevtushenko was thought of as being too closely allied with the quote unquote authorities. However, when he died, the New York Times in 2017 called him a dissident poet. That doesn't even actually begin to cover the ground, because he appears to be a dissident poet at some point. I think for me, the key is that he pushed the envelope as far as he could with this poem and the one that's called The Heirs of Stalin, Nasledniki Stalina. And so people, I can't tell you exactly what the average Russian thought of this. I'm sure that the Soviet government was nervous about it because it doesn't expose the kinds of things that Ursula talked about, the covering over of what really happened in Babi Yar and who was really involved and so on. That's the best I can give you at the moment.
Thank you. Daniel, did you want to comment about early responses to the symphony?
Sure, yeah. Well, the official communist response was kind of like, let's put the brakes on that. They didn't quite repress it, but they did sort of take it out of circulation. I believe they asked Yevtushenko to make some changes to the text so that it would be a little less critical. I should mention that there are 4 other movements of the symphony, and they're all, fairly critical of the Soviet system in one way or another. And but it was never flat out suppressed in the same way that, you might have seen on the graphic that Shostakovich's Fourth Symphony, for example, that he put that aside for something like 20 years from the 30s until the 60s. So it never suffered that kind of fate. Meanwhile, in the West, I think it took a long time for Western critics to really understand what this was. And that's because for many years, there was this view of Shostakovich while he was alive that he was just this loyal kind of Soviet stooge composer, and that he was just doing what the party told him to do. And so they didn't quite know what to make of this until a book came out after his death, which is supposedly his memoirs. It's not quite so clear cut as that, in which he was sort of exposed as being much more of a dissident and much more complicated than what had been supposed in the West before that. It's by Solomon Volkov. It's called A Testimony. So, you know, sadly, I think that this symphony is really underperformed in the West. It is occasionally brought out every once in a while, but it is not part of the really standard repertoire in the United States or in most of the West. And I'm hoping, I think it's one of the most magnificent and powerful pieces that Shostakovich ever wrote. And I'm hoping that discussions like this one will help to change that fact.
Me too. And so this question is probably a question for all of you, but let's start with Ursula. So in the 1940s, Theodor Adorno notably said, "It is barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz." And I think there's a lot of different interpretations of what he meant. But I know a lot of people say that what he meant was that artistic expression is inadequate to express the reality of the Holocaust. And so I'd like to hear from you about your thoughts about artistic responses to the Holocaust as memorial or as testimony, like the one that we're speaking about this evening. Ursula?
So for me personally, the most meaningful commemoration is research, archival historical research, retrieving identities of the victims, hearing the survivors' stories, documenting what happened and raising awareness. But I understand that everybody has different ways to process this history and to express their emotions about the history. So yes, some people will respond better to poetry, some people will respond better to music, and our museum collects artwork created in response to the Holocaust and created both by survivors and people who did not experience the Holocaust themselves. So there is a variety of media that can be used to respond to this history.
Thank you. And Daniel or Victor, did you want to add anything? I know, he was speaking directly about poetry, but certainly, all types of art, whether it's performance, fine art, theater, and so on, if you wanted to talk about that as a reaction to the Holocaust.
Well, poetry has the ability in just a couple of words or a phrase to cover whole events, phenomena, and so on. And this poem, Babi Yar by Yevtushenko, would be a good example of that in so many places. And Ursula's right. For some people, it's really poetry that says things best. It's a great tradition in the Russian, in Russian poetry. Pushkin, like in Yevgeny Onegin, just a couple of words is all it took. And as a reader, you have to fill in the rest of the story. You have to you have to deduce, as it were, from context from just these couple of words. And the same kind of thing could be said perhaps about Yevtushenko's poem.
Thank you.
Yeah, and another thing that I think is important about artistic creations is that sometimes the research is not there. Sometimes people don't even know that there's something to be researched there. And, you know, the very first line of this poem is, "On Babi Yar, there are no monuments," which was the case in 1961, because it was something that the Soviets didn't want to acknowledge. And the fact that this poem was written and the fact that the symphony was composed and performed drew very, very poignant attention to that fact. And I think that, you know, there must be acknowledged how powerful the arts can be in creating a call to action among society and drawing awareness to things of this nature. Very often it's very difficult. I'm no researcher, but I know that researching something like the Holocaust is extremely difficult because of so much, you know, complicated efforts to erase what happened, efforts to get rid of evidence and things like that. It takes, you know, lifetimes of dedication, as we've seen, in order to keep that history going. But the spark of doing it is sometimes an artistic creation, a poem, a song, a painting.
Well said. And then I have a few questions from our viewers. One person asked, are you commemorating only Jewish victims? And they note that there were Poles there as well as several other groups as well. Are you aware of this? So I'd have Ursula respond to this question.
So thank you for this question. I mentioned earlier other victim groups who were murdered prior to the massacre of September 29th and 30th and afterwards. So tonight we are commemorating that particular massacre that was carried out against the Jewish victims. The Holocaust was the systematic persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and their collaborators. So yes, there were other victims of the Nazi regime, but the Holocaust refers to the persecution and murder of Jews. And the massacre at Babi Yar was part of it, was part of the so-called Holocaust by bullets, where victims were massacred in mass shootings. And that's why we are focusing on this part of history today.
Thank you. And another question for Ursula, which is why is Holocaust remembrance still relevant in 2021? And also, why is it important that young people today, and really all people, should learn the lessons of the Holocaust?
Thank you for this question, a very important one. So this commemoration and research and remembrance is still relevant for lots of reasons. First of all, research is still ongoing. So new data is being discovered in the archives from non-Jewish witnesses, from survivors. This information is still being collected. So this history is still living. We are still finding new facts, retrieving new identities of the victims, but also those lessons are very relevant today that we can learn from this difficult history. As I mentioned earlier, the concept of choice, that's something that we should think about in our own lives today, tomorrow, because that shapes our reality around us today and helps to shape the world for the generations that will come after us. We need to be able to investigate what happened and draw the lessons, apply them to our world, our life today. That's in the mission of the Florida Holocaust Museum. That's why we do what we do.
Thank you, Ursula. And then I just wanted another question. I'm sorry, I wanted to ask one more question from Helena. She'd like to know if the symphony is still performed today, and maybe how recently.
Yes, it's still performed, and it is performed. You know, on a sort of a slow burn around the world. It's occasionally performed. It's not like Beethoven's 5th Symphony or something, which is performed far more commonly. But for example, I saw a performance of it live in Dallas a few seasons ago. I saw another performance. Well, the thing that sparked my interest in the piece was seeing a live performance when I lived in Russia. I think it's more common in Russia or Russian-speaking countries simply because it uses a Russian text, and you really need to have a chorus that's comfortable with that, which is harder to find in Western Europe and in the United States and North America. Not impossible. Certainly anyone can learn to do it, but it is a little bit more outside the comfort zone.
Thank you. And then let's see if we have any other questions before we close. Okay, so I would just like to ask if each one of you had any closing remarks, you know, whether it's in reference to the history of Babi Yar, or of course, Yevtushenko's poem or the symphony. Does anybody want to go first? Victor, did you have any closing remarks?
No, there's many things that with more time that I would have said already. One is that Yevtushenko, like most poets, had all kinds of different poems. These would probably fall in the tradition, and it's a Russian tradition, goes back to the 19th century, of civic poetry. In other words, raising questions, raising problems and so on that pertain to the civic character, the moral character, and so on of a society. And so that's maybe the one thing I would say, other than the fact that just one of the reasons we wanted to show him reading it is his an amazing talent for communicating what he has written. There are other people who recite their poetry and they do it very well, and it's all, but this is on a whole different level.
Thank you.
And I would say that one of the great characteristics of that poem and of this piece, which I think is very applicable to the modern world, is how it shows empathy, how it shows Yevtushenko, the poet, talks about, now I am Dreyfus, now I am Anna Frank. You know, he imagines himself in the position of these people who suffered terribly under anti-Semitic pogroms throughout history. And I think that empathy is something that we could use a lot more of in the 21st century. And I hope that that's a lesson that's very, very pertinent that we can all take with us. In addition to that, I'd just like to say thank you so much for for being part of this panel, Ursula. That was such a very moving presentation of this horrifying event, and Victor, a very moving presentation on Yevtushenko. And I'm jealous that you actually got to see him perform live. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago, and I never got the chance myself.
I got to see him perform a number of times, and I missed him one time when he performed in Sydney, Australia, where I was living and teaching at the time. But it's really amazing to witness that, to be part of it.
Thank you. Ursula, did you have any last remarks? I know you spoke beautifully just a moment ago.
Thank you. Thank you to my colleagues. I just wanted to remind everyone that by studying this history, we become witnesses to history. So we take on a responsibility to remember, to investigate, to pass on the information. So please take the time to think about the victims. Again, after the program, I will post a link in the chat on Facebook, where you will be able to look at pages of testimony submitted for some of the victims from Babi Yar. Some of them have photographs. All of them have individual names. And please don't forget about that lesson about choices. The perpetrators that we discussed today and collaborators were human beings who chose to hate. And genocide ends with violence, but starts with thoughts, misconceptions. So let's stop for a second in our lives and think how we perceive ourselves, our neighbors, people thousands of miles away. What do we think about other people? Can we draw any lessons from this history? So these are my closing remarks. Remember, investigate, educate.
I can't think of anything better to say than that. That's exactly the mission of the Florida Holocaust Museum. So as we close this program, I want to thank each of our panelists, Victor, Daniel, and Ursula, for your generosity in sharing this evening, and to thank you all who are watching for spending your evening with us. Please don't forget to fill out the survey. We've posted a link to that in the comments below, and have a wonderful evening. Thanks so much.